Hello, everyone. My name is Kanchan Naik, and I'm the youth editor of India Currents. For those of you who are new to India Currents, we're an online magazine based in the Bay Area, and we've been around for 33 years serving the South Asian diaspora in America, making us the longest standing Bay Area magazine to service South Asians. We are so excited to welcome back our previous watchers and welcome the new ones. For today's interview, we're joined by Amit Patel, a professional dancer, choreographer, and teacher based in Fremont, California. From performing at national events like the Indiaspora inaugural ball in Washington D.C. to being a part of America's Got Talent, Amit Patel has played a major role in the representation of Desi dance on global platforms. Thank you for joining us, Amit.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So, yeah, hello.
Sure.
Might be a little awkward, but I'll try my best.
For sure.
You're fine.
Perfect. So I had the opportunity to watch your interview with KQED, where you kind of spoke about how your journey as a dancer kind of began with the Mona Khan Dance Company. And I just love to know more about, your experience and how Khan kind of helped like cultivate your interest in dancing.
Yeah, so actually I began dancing initially with I mean everyone has a different origin story. For me, it actually started off a little bit more with my mom and like Garba and Ross and folk dance, and then it kind of went on into um, Bollywood because my parents thought I was becoming too American and not Indian enough. So they're like, "You need some culture in you, right?" And so then that's actually when I was like 11, 12 maybe when I like enrolled with Mona. And honestly, I think it was quite life changing because I think one of the biggest things with the Bay Area and any sort of diaspora story, first gen, born here, all those kind of things. There's a huge conversation about identity and what makes you you. And I think for what Mona did and provided as a Bollywood dance company was she kind of allowed for all of us to explore that part of our roots without having to give up our daily, the daily things that just make us very American. And, so that was, yeah, I think it was very impactful. I think for me, I got very in touch with my, roots in terms of dance and the arts. And I think along the way it definitely sparked me to become pursue it full time as a career, and go and go in more depth about it in the future. So I definitely think she was like very impactful, and even to this day, the fact that I'm still doing dance as a career is definitely a testament to that for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Um, I thought it was really interesting how you brought up, your parents saying that like we need to put some culture in you because it's so interesting. I think among a lot of Indian Americans, Bollywood is kind of almost like a reaction in a way for us, like a reaction to perhaps our parents' anxieties about us becoming too Western or perhaps not carrying on the same traditions that they grew up with. So yeah, I'd just love to know a little bit more about your experience being a part of the South Asian diaspora and what it meant to kind of maybe blend both your culture along with you know bridge the boundaries between these two cultures.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's a big one to tackle. I think I think we all have our different again the different stories about like not really fitting in, being neither here nor there, right? And then having to code switch and like put on a different hat when you're at home versus when you're at school. And I think for me, my takeaway from a lot of it was. I really hated switching hats all the time. I was like, this is very frustrating having to be like, hide one part of my identity or even the fact that I was like queer and figuring that out, right? So now you're dealing with three different types of identities as well, right? And even like questioning all aspects of queerness, right? How to express, how to, dress, how to interact with other people, and lower my voice to sound deeper and like deeper like a man, or like all these, various things, right? And so for me, dance was definitely my way of exploring that, and and through performance, ideally I wanted to show people how different perspective, right? There's so many different ways to like create sort of some sort of social change. You can work in politics, you can work in media, you can do any sort of thing. And another medium for people to process information, I feel, is often dance, right? Or not just dance, but the arts in general. And so for me, when I finally decided to pursue it a lot more full time, I was what interested me the most was um, artwork and dance pieces and stories that kind of like push the narrative or push the conversations a little bit. And so one thing that the two main things I teach now are Indian contemporary and Bollywood heels. And a little bit about both the philosophies for both are with Indian contemporary, I studied Bollywood. I did I'm not classically trained in, with a formal group, but all my teachers, they were all classically trained in like Kathak, Bharatanatyam, Chow, Kuchipudi, like all of that, like all those things. So it was all of that was influenced in the work that I did. And I also grew up dancing folk dance like Garba Ras. And then the flip side of that, I also trained in ballet, jazz, modern, contemporary, and hip hop as well. And so for me, a lot of times, I was like, okay, I was in a contemporary company for like 6 years, and all the work was beautiful. It was all about like sharing women's stories, and it was like a really amazing company. But then I didn't resonate with the music, or like I wish I wanted to implement some bits of like Indian storytelling and music interpretation in that. And then same thing in the company that I was with Mona, right? And eventually for me, I think I wanted to find a happy medium where I was like, okay, there is a reality where you can find balance and you can exist as both, Indian and American, at least for me, right? That was like my identity. And so for me, I was like, okay, Indian contemporary kind of like slaps everything I'm into, all in one. And I'm going to explore all the different disciplines within that, right? What does it mean to actually fuse something? You have to understand history, you have to understand where it comes from, you have to and then you kind of exist and in this like new space, and you kind of allow other people to, join in along the ride. And so I think that was definitely one big area where I felt, okay, this is what I want to do, and I would want more people to be involved in this kind of thinking when it comes to the arts, right? Because otherwise, um, I sometimes also feel like otherwise, a lot of people are kind of gatekeepers to the arts, like, oh, if you're only Indian, if you only certain types of people can do certain types of art forms. But I was like, I don't really fit in either one of those spaces. And Bollywood also at the time is still very heteronormative, and I didn't identify with that kind of approach. And so I was like, but I still love, Indian culture, Indian music, Indian stories, right? So for me, like that was definitely the route that I wanted to take. Um, but then like the last part of it was also, exploring, I guess like identity and the cross between the two, the multiple identities was also the Bollywood Heels class I teach. And so that was a very different um, mental approach for me and so as we were talking about Bollywood, I was steering away from the general, item numbers and all the, the very male, the typecasted role that men would traditionally have in these dance productions. And so for me, I was like, I've never danced sensually. I've never been sexy on stage in a like more traditionally feminine way. I've never worn heels, but I was like, I knew when I took my first like heels class from Giannis Marshall, I felt, that feeling when you have like heels on or whatever, or you put on a new outfit, or you put on makeup, or you take a shower, you just feel like invigorated. You're a whole new person. You're like, I can conquer the world, right? That was like one of the feelings I had for the first time I put on heels and taught in heels, right? First time I took a class, and then eventually I was like, why isn't anyone doing this to Bollywood music, right? And so that was like there was no one doing it, and I personally I'm a little, on the lazier side. I prefer just to take someone else's class, work under someone's thing, but then no one was teaching it, no one was doing it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to start a class, right? What's the worst that'll happen, right? No one's going to show up. And ideally, that was the initial intent. And then it kind of created something cooler, right? It kind of created like a community of people. The first class I taught, there were about 3 queer people that came up. One of them was like the guy who was in the closet, and he's like, I've never danced in heels. I never thought to, but then you like my face was on the poster in heels, and so he was just like the fact that you were doing it. And I also was not out of the closet at the time, so in retrospect, I accidentally outed myself. But
so did your parents, I mean, you're from the Bay Area, you're putting these flyers up in Fremont. So your mom must have seen them, right? Like she didn't know prior to that. So did she just like happen upon a poster and was like, what is this?
Honestly, See, it's all a little bit of a blur at the moment. It's been a couple of years now, but I think the way it started was I had this idea, and for me, I was like, I'm kind of like a little out there when it comes to like the arts. I'm kind of like, oh, I want to try something, and it's somewhat very experimental more often than not. But with the heels thing, I was like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. I'm just exploring the arts. I'm just exploring another form of dance and movement, right? It's not like it's like like actors, they wear makeup, right? They like, or like it doesn't, just because you wear heels, it doesn't actually out you. It's just the perception of that society has of what that heel represents, right? And so I think for me, I was like, oh, I'm just exploring art form. It's like in class, like in when I used to take ballet, I even, there was a point in time when I took like was on point for a little bit, right? And like traditionally men don't do point work at all, right? And so I was like, oh, but like it's just, I'm just a next step or a different type of form of the dance. And so I was very naive, I didn't realize, but definitely as soon as I like posted it, a lot of my friends were, my parents were not on social media, so it worked out. And I posted it predominantly on social media. And so eventually that conversation came like a year down the line, but initially they weren't really they weren't too aware.
I actually saw, I don't know how through social media, I saw your Bolly Heels class when you first were promoting it. So it's cool to hear about like your thought process throughout the whole thing, and how you got there, because I think like it's interesting, we're all trying to find our identities through art, right? Like you're talking about the Indian American identity. It's like such a huge portion of who we are, and we're all exploring. I don't know if you know this, but Kanchan is the Youth Poet Laureate of Pleasanton. She's an amazing poet.
That's amazing. Oh my God, wow.
She's amazing. I mean, you don't even know half of it, but she's an amazing poet. So like, she's exploring a lot of, her Indian American identities, which now, are you first generation or second generation, Kanchan?
Oh, I'm a second generation.
So second generation, you and I are first generation Indian Americans. Yeah. We're already in two different phases, but it's cool to hear that, I actually, it's funny because you're like, oh, I want to move away from Bollywood. And I mean, I did Bollywood, but I went further into like classical dance, because I found classical dance embraces queerness way, way more than any other dance form I had ever done in Bollywood or whatever.
Yeah.
Because there's the concept of Arthanari Swara, which is that you embody.
Yeah, exactly. The Shiv and Parvati,
Yeah. Male and female characteristics, and you're allowed to be like gender and sexually like fluid. I mean, that's kind of like a lot of actually Indian mythology and stuff kind of relies heavily on that. And it's just, I always preach about this because I get very frustrated with colonial cultures that have like changed the ways that like, trans people are perceived, gay people are perceived in India. All these things, all the things that have happened have come from the Western lens on the Indian culture. So, you're taking it back and you're reclaiming your space, and I'm sure like I'm doing it in my way, but I love hearing that like what your process was of even getting there, because I think I agree, like prior to your flyer, whatever went on that went kind of viral on social media, I don't think I'd heard of a Bolly Heels class even once. So then now I definitely have. I don't know if you started it or what, but I've definitely heard of Bolly Heels since. But I remember thinking that's like, oh, that's novel. I've never heard of anybody doing that. So I am very appreciative of the fact that you have, created a space like that. And I think like my question was a little bit of what you've already answered. Like, what did you think that you were offering was like so special and specific to like Bay Area Indians? Because there is so much art and culture in this area specifically because there's a high concentration of Indian people. So I mean, you mentioned it, but just like articulate it a little bit more if you want to.
Yeah, like I think for like, like even like expanding exactly on what you were saying, right? There was, so the initial approach was, one, I wanted to, it was like partially selfish. I was like, okay, I want to explore this kind of like movement and philosophy just for myself as well, but also by extension, I feel like a lot of like the women that I was dancing with, a lot of them were kind of vilified for dancing or being sexy, right? Or what is that, and I was like, but why, right? Like if you want to, like it's like, as long as you're doing it for yourself versus like for other reasons or whatever it may be. And so I was like, my biggest approach was creating safe spaces, because I think a lot of times, and this was again like 5-ish years ago, 5+ years ago, right? About 5 years ago when I first started, and there was not, it was like a very different like playing field, right? There wasn't a whole lot, there was no Bollywood Heels. Mine was definitely the first one in like the States, right? But then like immediately after, there was like a whole wave of like people like in New York and Toronto and all that. And I think for me, I was like, that's okay. Like I'm not here to like, be like, this is my brand, this is my like little thing. I was like, the whole point of it was about creating safe spaces and allowing for people to like kind of explore that kind of movement and just, like have something, right, that extends a little bit beyond, because even within like for like classical in terms of history definitely is a lot more open in terms of like gender than all the mythology stories. Oh my gosh, there's so many there's so many really interesting ones, even like the one of Shikandi, right, and like all of the Amba Bhishma, that whole situation, right, there's so many interpretations of it, right. But I felt it was either you're stuck in that lens or you're stuck in a Bollywood lens. And I feel like I wanted more space in between. And I think that's kind of where I was, just like from my own like upbringing in growing up in Fremont, I felt that I was like, okay, I'm definitely in between both like these different schools of thought. And so why not just create something and see what happens? But yeah, it's really beautiful to see how people approach it. And yeah, I'm very happy with like the community that's been created from it.
I think to kind of touch back on that point that you mentioned about being stuck between these different schools of thought while you were dancing, if you're comfortable sharing, I was curious to know if you received like any pushback of any sort from people who consider themselves musical like purists in the dance space who believe like different forms of art should be like left in their own like space.
Yes, actually, well, yes and no. I think, oh gosh, okay. So in terms of hate, social media is like, like a entire space and a half to be on. The first time I posted anything on YouTube, just like YouTube is just like, who knows what's gonna happen, right? You can be like, there'll be like maybe like 1,000 bad comments, but then there'll be like a few thousand really amazing comments. You can never control like what people think in that way. To be honest, most feedback I've gotten is pretty good. I will say that there are gonna be, it's always a battle to push the narrative and sometimes or push the status quo, because sometimes the status, like people, that's a very debatable topic, right? But like if for me, my approach has been, okay, I've learned like enough of the history. I've had a lot of classical like teachers. I've taken like intensives in New York. I've taken like, in like Bharatanatyam, in Chow and all these other forms, right? To like talk to the gurus and be like, hey, what are your thoughts on X, Y, and Z things about fusion, all that, right? Interestingly enough, a lot of like one of my like I personally took a Bharatanatyam intensive from in India, was a lot more open to fusion than some of the classical instructors that I had here, right? In the States, there were a lot more like, no, nothing can touch this, right? This is exactly what it is, and we have to preserve it till the end of time, right? And in India, I felt like it was a lot more open, which I was very surprised by. I felt like there were a lot of people open to the idea, as long as it comes from a place of understanding. I think that there's a balance and a way to go about it. I think that a lot of people, especially with social media being so accessible for anyone and everyone, that sometimes what you will see people just like throwing a mudra here, throwing a mudra there, which is totally fine too. I mean, I'm not gonna say it's totally fine, but it's one thing that gets put out, right? It's also not my job to like police everyone and what they're all doing, right? But I do think that if, as long as for me was, as long as I know what my approach is, and I think every time I've ever taught a class, I always, put a disclaimer, before class saying like, hey, we're going to be using some classical gestures, and these are where they come from. These are their names. All these like, all these kind of like small like details as part of the class to show like, okay, I'm using like the footwork from, from ballet, but I'm using like the upper half of like this, or, like that's one way to approach it. So I think, at least that's been my philosophy. So I think, so as long as that's been clear, even if there have been some like flashback here and there, nothing's been too critical, because anytime I have a conversation with someone, I think it's like, we can agree to disagree, but it's never that like, that extreme.
Yeah, that was a good question, Kanchan. I actually feel like I understand it a little bit better, not because I was trying to be critical or judgmental in any way, but obviously having done Kathak for like 15 to 18 years of my life, you know, I remember when I would do Bollywood, you know, when I was younger, and my Kathak teacher would be pissed. She would be like, you are a bad dancer, and it has everything to do with the fact that you keep doing Bollywood dance, because I really liked competing and stuff. So my mom would let me do all these ICC competitions and all that. I did them all, and I always won. So I was really excited about doing them, and I liked it, like whatever, you know, and I don't want to do it now, but I remember it, like that purist mentality definitely, it came from, it's interesting that you also say that, you know, in India that they have a very different view, because even now I'm still dancing, and my teachers are very much like of the mindset, like, do not mix things. And I'm not one to say whether or not that's right or wrong. I don't know. Or I think your explanation of it was quite reasonable, and I get where you're coming from, but it is like a real debate, like, okay, especially here, because people are really holding on to the culture pretty tightly. It's like, we're not in India, so, you know, we gotta like hold it close to us, like, yeah. So it's interesting to hear your viewpoint, because I've always been of two minds about it. I think, like you said, if you come from a place of understanding and you're like, know the history, know the culture, because having done Kathak for so long, I know the amount of intensity it takes, the amount of like dedication, understanding, like, and that said, like, you've dedicated your whole life to dance, so I can't ever criticize somebody who's like dedicating their time like that, because even I'm not dedicating my life like that, you know, like I have a job and then I do Kathak. It's not like Kathak is my life and then I'm doing another thing. So I don't know the answer. I definitely think the way that you're doing it sounds like the right way to do it, but I'm not sure if everyone is convinced of it, you know, like, it's an interesting, it's definitely an Indian American debate to be having. I would say.
I mean, it's definitely also not like there's no right or wrong answer here, because I definitely understand the philosophy, like the approach of like, oh, like, no, but like, I mean, one example within just dance history, right? Like, for example, ballet is like one thing, and ballet eventually, like, the structure of ballet was very rigid, right? It was very like women and like the corsets, though, like the whole like it was just like unrealistic, and it was a very like detrimental to women in general, specifically in ballet. All the choreographers were men. Eventually ballet turned into modern dance, right? Modern dance was kind of like, okay, ballet, everything's turned out, and like, you know, in terms of form and stuff, and you know, the women would be like concave. In modern, they would be a lot different, right? So it started off by just simple acts of rebellion. Instead of pointing your feet, they would flex their feet, right? So it all started off with very incremental changes throughout time. Eventually modern dance became what we know as contemporary and lyrical, and it developed into jazz, it developed into all these other things, but it took a process of evolution. The difference is that ballet doesn't have any sort of religious or any sort of connotation. I think that's also a bigger discussion point, because almost all of it, like Indian classical dance, is they're retelling the stories that may or may not be true, right? And but the thing is, because enough people believe them, to the point where it's kind of seen as fact, or like our history, or, you know, this, you know, then it gets a little confused, it gets a little bit more cluttered, because now, because it has like it has our history or a root, it can't be touched, right?
I guess I didn't even view it that way. The way that I at least here, as someone doing classical dance, what I saw was more like there's tradition, like there is a history of like being taught a certain, like, you come from a gharana, so you're being taught a certain way, you're learning a certain type of style, and like it comes from generations of learning. It comes from like the Mughal courts, and then the mixing of all these things. So it's even that, it's not like pure, you know. So I'm not one to even say it's pure. Like I think it's just this. I think it's Indian American specifically, because we are so far from India. We feel so connected to our culture, and we try so hard to not change it and view it a certain way. And it's like that tradition can only be passed if you do it this way. And it's so technical, right? It's like ballet. It's so technical. People don't realize how technical classical dance is, because it looks like kind of simple, or it looks, you know, whatever. But it's like, even like now I have to like tell my dad, like even the most simple movement is actually quite complex because you have to place your hand a certain way, your hand has to fold a certain, and that's like ballet, that's like contemporary, that's like any form of dance requires that. So I just think that it's that cultural component of like, we are in America and we don't have any other connections, so this is the one that we hold on to. I really think it's that, because I don't feel like you're wrong. I think or any dance form will evolve over time, right? Like, it doesn't stay the same. So how can we expect that?
Yeah, it's also like one of my friends, Beeb, he did his master's at St. Mary's, and his history and background is on, he was from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he was doing his master's thesis on Congolese contemporary, right? And so, and the interesting thing about his thesis was his entire dance history and dance form of the Congo was all passed down visually, and it was all passed down as so all their dances are war stories that are passed down from one generation to the next, right? So they don't have written text, they don't have videos, they don't have any of that. They just have dance war stories that are passed down from one gen to the next, right? But in his approach, and his thesis was about Congolese contemporary and finding ways to still maintain those roots, but finding new ways of storytelling through different movement avenues, right? And I think that's like also something that it was just something I found very powerful, because I was like, oh, when I saw his actual thesis in person, I was like, this is really cool, because you could tell where the other influences are, you could tell where the roots are, but it didn't feel, but maybe that's just me as a viewer, right? I felt like I was introduced and invited in, but I also saw how it's changing. And I think that's something that at least with all of us in like this generation who came here or like are born here, there is some sort of change that I think is like inevitable. And I feel like that's like, it basically accounts for more of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, even just like from generation to generation, like you and I being first, I'm sure like the questions that Kanchan is asking and talking about in her art form is totally different than, actually, we do these basic poetry readings, and I will see like the older people and Kanchan will have poems, and they both will be speaking on the same topic, but to approach it from totally different angles, right? Like they might be like, why is she talking about Coachella? And then I remember you wrote a really nice poem about cultural appropriation in Coachella, and they were talking about like war and like,
oh my gosh,
like a very different, not even that neither of them is not as significant or important or isn't talking about cultural, it's just like a different way to approach it. So I actually, it'd be interesting to ask them, like, what do they think about, they all love Kanchan, by the way, so I'm sure they're embracing it as well. They're adapting and changing, and all of it is good. So we should go back to
sure. So I was enjoying it, so I'm okay.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks Srishti actually for bringing up the Desi poetry readings. From a poet's perspective, I think it's been like a wonderful opportunity to kind of connect with people of the older generation and kind of see, like what we have in common, and kind of bond over the things that even we don't have in common. But I think one point that really resonated with me was how you mentioned like what you took out of watching these performances as a member of the audience, and how that's just the way that you perceived it. And I was kind of wondering, and maybe this might be like a bit more of an abstract or like philosophical question, but I was wondering if you think there's kind of a difference between what like a dancer takes out of the process of this art, like through dancing, and what the audience takes away from it.
Oh my God, yeah, that's a big that's always such a debate, right? Because with any sort of performative art form, there's always this, how far do you want to steer into the abstract, right? Versus, and I guess that's like a general truth to like, poetry, even to writing. Like, do you want to just like write about something and, not kind of leave it somewhat open-ended? Do you or do you want to draw a clear narrative, right? For anyone who views it. Definitely from as a dancer, I can appreciate other dances a lot more, but then that comes with a grain of salt. I can also critique a lot of dances with that a lot more too. But I don't know what's right or wrong in that. There's no right or wrong. I think it's just a lot of it just has to be approach, what your approach is. a lot of times what the thing that I find difficult with dance sometimes, and even sometimes with classical, I feel is sometimes it's not, as a dancer myself, who like I've been through like over 15 orangethums, and I can tell you, like, as much as I love all these orangethums, right, like I don't enjoy all of them, even though I know I'm supposed to, right? And even as a dancer, and as a dancer, like I'm like, wow, they have so much stamina. Wow, they know, like they've like this is amazing, right? But some of it felt very unrelatable to me as a viewer. I wasn't able to go through the entire process, and for a long time, like after like the first like 10, I was like, I'm just such a shitty dancer. I'm not appreciating this enough, right? But then like it got to a point where I was, like I got older and I was talking to the parents. I was talking to like random audience members. They had no idea what was going on. They were just there to support. They're like, we don't know anything. We're just like here. Some of them are like, and not to say that that's, you should cater your performance to that. I think it's sometimes, some forms are more inviting to outsiders that don't know enough about it, and some aren't. And so I think that's something that it's not a deciding factor, but something to consider in the creative process, right? And so in Arngreatham specifically, that's like more of like a talent showcase, right? Like, or like you've earned your like, it's kind of like when you go for your black belt and they like, you hit like hit the bricks, or your taekwondo and you like, crack the bricks or whatever, right? That's like your, yeah. So that's like, yeah, no, but like pretty like everything you're saying, I'm like the whole time I'm just like, yes, exactly, right? Because it's true though, right? Like, but at the same time, like I like it was the same in modern dance, because I was like in the modern dance scene for quite a while in San Francisco as well. And eventually what ended up happening was the only people showing up to these modern dance performances were other modern dancers, choreographers, and anyone else that I would bring into shows. They'd be like, okay, we just watched an hour piece and then we didn't know what it was about. And then at the end, we found out that it was about something else. And we were like, okay, like, like, okay, we didn't get that. And then they were like, they're like, they didn't understand it. They didn't. And I was like, maybe that's like a, and also, by the way, modern dance is also dying right now, right? And like and theater dance, in theaters, obviously they're all like kind of dying. It's like hurting my soul a little bit. But
COVID, you're saying?
I mean, it was dying before COVID, but like COVID completely like killed theater. Yeah, for sure. So sad. But yeah, no, I agree, and I don't know if there is a right answer, right? I do think that anyone who wants to preserve it and loves what they're doing, they should just keep on doing it, right? But I don't think that should disbar anyone else from wanting to adapt it at all, right?
So yeah, hopefully this is just a good step in the right direction for all of us, and we're all learning from it. Because I think even like the other Kathak places are kind of dying out. You don't really hear of too many anymore. It's really just like CDI and Anuradha Didi, and so I don't know, like performing arts are really suffering, and I'm sad to hear about it. Kanchan, should we wrap it up with a KQED question? So we didn't.
Oh my God, yeah, sorry. Totally forgot why we're here. Okay.
No, this was great. Honestly, I like forgot about time because like I was just like, yeah, no, but this was amazing. I guess just harkening back to dance and your experience, I was wondering like what advice do you have for younger dancers who want to promote inclusivity while also like cultivating their art?
I guess like a few things. One, I guess like with any sort of dance and just exploring the arts, I feel like the biggest thing that the best learning lesson I had was taking class and constantly training and like and learning and hearing from learning from new people and different teachers to really get get different perspectives. So I feel like the biggest thing is always just training, and and the more you learn, the more you'll get perspective, and you'll just understand what you resonate with, what you don't resonate with. Like for the first time I felt super empowered in like a contemporary class. I was like, that feeling was so surreal that I like everything else I was like, I don't really need to like worry about that. I like this feeling. I know what I want to like emulate in my classes. I know all these other things. So I feel like with anyone exploring, whether it's just their identity, that's one, like, is if they're trying to explore identity there, and there's a lot of great ways to like find teachers that you like. Now thankfully we have social media. Find someone you like teaching and kind of just be like, sign up for a class and then see what that brings on. But the like one thing that I the reason I've loved contemporary a lot was because it kind of, for me, it was a kind of like a window to the soul. You were able to take a class, and then the teacher kind of prompts you, kind of like makes you like think about like what, okay, the basic format is what makes you sad, what makes you happy, like, oh, think about a moment when, you know, they kind of prompt you into these like guided discussions, and then you kind of explore that through movement, right? And then, you know, sometimes there's a sad song that plays as well, and then you kind of let it out, right? And I think that was something for me that I felt really powerful. And I feel like one thing that I've noticed is the more I teach, the more I feel that not enough people tap into that aspect of themselves and become vulnerable. So I think, you know, if you're in the process of exploration, is find different, you know, things of different like dance classes or teachers that kind of make you go deep and become a little vulnerable, and make you really question things, right? I think that like that kind of challenge is very, it just makes you learn a lot and grow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to kind of wrap up our interview. I think whether you're doing dance or writing or whatever art form you're tapping into, I love this idea of vulnerability and kind of like being able to expose yourself and who you truly are through self-expression. So yeah, thank you so much once again for being a part of this interview.
I have one more question before we wrap up.
Go for it.
What is like, you obviously said that KQED was kind of a broad message and you had to tailor it, and it wasn't, you know, there was 4 hours of footage, you only got 12 minutes of time. Like, what are things that you think the KQED video kind of, you know, not missed out on, but didn't cover? And how do you feel like it was a broader message, and how would you make it more specific? Like, what were the
Yeah, like, so I think like, I mentioned this, like, you know, it's so hard to consolidate all these topics into like one, like, you know, clear cut like message, right? You know, we're talking about, you know, identity, we're talking about like mixed cultures, we're talking about like gender, we're talking about like expression, then we're also talking about dance and discipline and history, right? So all these things are like so, you know, interconnected, right? So I think the one thing that, if anything, I would say is just like going more in depth on all of those things about what aspects of what is like the first gen experience, first gen Indian American experience, what does that look like? How does that like really, and all the layers around it? That's something that's very hard to communicate. You know, like even just amongst the three of us, we all have you know, three very different perspectives on what that looks like, right? So I don't know how to answer that question. I feel like, you know, I feel like there could be a whole documentary on the first gen experience, right? But
I think our experiences are not so far off either. Like, from our conversation, actually sounds like, though we've explored them in totally different ways, we've also actually kind of had similar Indian American experiences, and it's cool that, you know, through art we're finding that we actually talk about it, you know, like this is a medium for us to have this conversation. I mean, and actually like now you can articulate it and have like this cool discussion. That's true. But I also wanted to touch on one thing that you said, and I mean, you said like how you started exploring this Bollywood Heels thing, and you were like, this isn't even about me being queer. It was like, you just put it out there as like, I'm exploring a new form of dance. And I think that's like, it's interesting because I do want to note that you don't have to be queer to like, to want to do it, to do that dance form, or to do any other dance form. Like, you could just be interested in it, or you could just feel like, this is a performative space, I feel like performing in this way. Like, it's such a spectrum. You might identify as queer, you might not identify as queer, but like the fact that we have these rigid structures and roles that we have to like identify a certain way, especially within the Indian culture too, like, you know, your mom's gonna see you like that, what does that mean, like, blah, blah, there's all these implications. And you might just be super straight and feel like I present myself in a more feminine way, and that's fine, you know? So I just wanted to say that because I like that you said it. Like, you know, it's important to remind people of that. But
I'm also I'm happy that you brought that up, because I think that's one of the biggest things with dance specifically. It's dance by in and of itself is not gendered, right? And all movement is not really gendered. We're just, as people, we kind of associate, okay, that's, you know, moving a certain way implies something specific, right? And I think that's like a huge reason why, like, when teaching classes, I'm very like cognizant of the fact that, okay, there'll be like a lot of people with different identities, backgrounds, and stories. So some movement that might some people will associate as traditionally masculine or traditionally feminine. I'm like, okay, you can dance it however you want, because like not everyone identifies in the same way. And I think it's really important for people to like allow people to explore that, because ultimately we're not trying to be like, the goal is not to be like, I'm like all these labels or you're all these labels and you can only exist within the confines of all those labels. Ideally, we're the goal is kind of just live and let live, right? But in order to get to that, I think there needs to be some sort of like, there needs to be like more steps taken to like for that inclusion process in general. But yeah, and so in classes, and the arts are one of them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think like you're already doing it, making the space, talking about it in a public platform like KQED takes a lot of courage. I mean, I'm sure like that's pretty scary to out. Like even though people have already, you're probably out to a lot of people. Every time you talk about it, it's like you're coming out to a whole new group of people. So yeah, thank you for doing that. And Kanchan, you can close it out.
All right. So yeah, thanks once again for being a part of this interview. For all our viewers, please make sure to check out both Amit's YouTube channel and Instagram, which will be linked in this video's article. And while you're at it, make sure to check out the rest of India Currents on our website and Instagram and Facebook as well. So yeah.
Awesome.